My name is Amelia Hartfield. I am 52 years old, and I work as an office administrator for a small insurance company in this city. For more than 3 decades, I've been the woman in the background, quietly balancing paperwork, crunching numbers, making sure everything runs smoothly while others get the credit. At home, it was the same. I carried the family with silent strength, while my husband Richard lived as if he were free of responsibility. One afternoon while cleaning Richard's car, I opened the glove compartment and found something that made my whole world tilt: a tube of lubricant. Cheap, glossy plastic. The chemical smell still clung to it. It wasn't mine. It wasn't for a marriage long gone cold. My hand shook as I picked it up. On the leather seat there was still a faint trace of stale sweetness clung to the leather, rubbing salt into the wound. My heart pounded slowly, heavily, like a hammer against my chest. But I didn't scream, I didn't ask, I didn't cry. I simply dropped it into my cleaning caddy, and from my own bag I took out a tube of industrial glue, the kind I used at the office to fix broken odds and ends. I set it back in the exact same spot. Quiet, precise. No trace left behind. That night I still set the table. I still poured the tea. I listened to Richard ramble about his after-hours work. But in my head the ticking of the clock sounded like a countdown. I was no longer the invisible wife. I was waiting for the moment. And then it came. One weekend night when the neighborhood was asleep, the fire alarm in the house Richard rented for his work shrieked into the dark. Sprinklers burst water pouring down, alarm strobes pulsed red, while sprinklers hammered the floor. A cool mist hung in the air. Neighbors thought the house was on fire. Fire trucks and ambulances swarmed in red lights, flashing across the street. Phones came out. People recorded. Clips spread instantly. I stood across the road, arms folded, watching as they dragged Richard and Allison, his mistress, outside. They were stuck together, drenched, humiliated, unable to walk. Whispers rose into a wave. Lucy, my elderly neighbor, leaned on her cane and said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "She deserved better all along." I smiled. Not because of triumph, but because I knew this was only the beginning. The neighborhood buzzed for days. The clip went online, spreading like wildfire, thousands of shares. Richard, once proud of his expensive suits, calling himself a successful businessman, had become a joke. Allison fared no better. She was taken to the hospital, but humiliation followed her there. Nurses whispered, doctors shook their heads, interns chuckled under their breath. No one called it an accident. They called it karma. My son Daniel wasn't there that night. But a few days later, he stood in front of me, his hands trembling as he held up his phone. "Mom, is this real?" The clip had reached his friends. His eyes carried shock, shame, and confusion. I didn't answer. I only poured tea into the old porcelain with a tired rim, the cup with its honest flaw, listening to the faint tap of ceramic on the wooden table. In that silence, I told myself, this is just the prologue. They think I'll cry, that I'll break. But no. I'll let the paperwork and the law speak for me. I often think back to the decades that shaped me, the quiet years when no one clapped for my efforts, when no spotlight ever landed on me. My life has been measured in pay stubs and late nights at a beige desk, the hum of a copier my constant companion. For more than 30 years, I worked as an office administrator. The salary was modest, never enough to impress anyone, but steady enough to keep food on the table and the lights paid for. Every extra dollar I tucked away in a savings account I rarely spoke of. Richard, my husband, drifted in and out of employment. He had periods where he wore ambition like a new suit, walking into ventures with bravado, only to stumble out months later with nothing but excuses. When he was unemployed, he paced the house restless and resentful, while I added overtime hours at the office. I never complained. I learned to stretch one paycheck into the illusion of stability. There were nights I stayed up balancing bills, cutting coupons, whispering numbers to myself like prayers. Groceries, gas, the mortgage all weighed against the fragile math of my income. Richard would grumble about dinners, too simple, about clothes, not fashionable enough. Still, I endured. During those lean years, I bought a chipped porcelain cup from a second-hand shop downtown. It cost only $1. I remember holding it in my hands, the glaze cracked, the rim uneven. Yet I kept it even when Richard rolled his eyes and asked why I wanted junk. For me, it became more than a cup. It was a symbol of endurance, proof that something flawed could still hold warmth. Each morning, I drank tea from it before leaving for work, and each evening, I returned to it as if it were an anchor, reminding me you can survive another day. Looking back, I see how invisible my sacrifices were. While Richard spoke loudly about dreams and ventures, I quietly paid bills. When Daniel needed braces, it was my paycheck that covered them. When Megan, then just Daniel's girlfriend, joined our holiday dinners, it was my hands preparing everything, my tired feet carrying the weight of tradition. Richard sat at the head of the table, glass in hand, while I moved around like a shadow. No one noticed how heavy the load had become, except perhaps me. And yet I carried it because I thought that was what love required. Richard had always been charming on the surface, the kind of man who could win over a room with a story and a laugh. People mistook his confidence for success. They didn't see how that charm curdled at home, how it turned into disdain when directed at me. To him, I was the safe harbor he resented for being too small. He looked at me the way someone might look at wallpaper, necessary but forgettable. There was one evening I can't erase. A family gathering, our dining room filled with cousins, neighbors' laughter, and the smell of roasted chicken. I had worked all day to prepare the meal. When the conversation turned to money, Richard leaned back in his chair, glass of wine in hand, and smirked. "Amelia doesn't really understand finances," he said, voice loud enough to hush the table. "She thinks saving pennies is the same as building wealth." The words struck harder than a slap. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. Around me, eyes shifted uncomfortably. Daniel, my son, fidgeted with his fork. His shoulders tense. He didn't look at me, didn't defend me, caught between the father he admired and the mother who held the bills together. Megan, sitting beside him, let out a small laugh. Sharp, rehearsed. She placed a hand on Daniel's arm and added, "He's right, you know. Sometimes being too cautious just keeps you stuck." Her words slid into the room like a blade. She was clever, subtle, presenting herself as the modern, practical woman, while making me appear old-fashioned and naive. I saw the way Richard's eyes lit up with approval at her comment, and in that glance, I understood they shared a language of ambition and condescension I was excluded from. I forced a smile. I poured more wine for a cousin past the breadbasket, pretended my dignity wasn't bleeding out on that tablecloth. Inside, though, something hardened. That moment was not just humiliation, it was a foreshadowing. I realized then that the bond I thought was family could easily become a chain dragging me down. It was the beginning of a quiet shift in me. For the first time, I asked myself if they see me as nothing more than the woman who pays bills and serves meals. What will stop them from taking more, my savings, my home, my very name? That night, as the dishes clattered in the sink, I whispered a promise to myself: I will not be erased. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as I was sorting files at my desk. The phone screen lit up with the name of my bank, and something inside me tightened. I answered, my voice polite but wary. "Mrs. Hartfield," the woman said. "We just want to verify a transfer request from your retirement account. It's a rather large amount, and we want to confirm you approved it." My breath caught. Retirement account. Transfer. The words tangled in my ears. I had not touched that account in years. It was the one thing I guarded carefully, the one safeguard I had built penny by penny across decades. I didn't request anything, I said. My voice was steady, but my fingers clutched the chipped porcelain cup on my desk, knuckles white. Within the hour, I was at the bank, sitting across from the same woman who had called. She slid a file toward me, and there it was, a transfer authorization form. Neat lines filled in my name, scrawled at the bottom. Only it wasn't my name. Not really. The signature was clumsy, as if someone had studied mine and tried to replicate it. Each letter exaggerated, each curve forced. To anyone glancing quickly, it might have passed. But to me, it was a cruel parody. My own identity mimicked like a mask. Heat spread through my chest, not the heat of anger, but of recognition. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a clerical error. Someone had reached into the most private part of my life, the account I had built alone, and tried to steal it. I whispered to myself so quietly the banker didn't hear. So they are not just stealing love, they're stealing my future. The banker slid the form back toward me, her brow furrowed. "We'll need to open a fraud claim. Mrs. Hartfield, I'll generate a case number today. That will trigger a temporary hold on the account, so no further transfers can be processed until this is resolved." She typed quickly, the click of her keyboard sharp against the silence. "Within 48 hours, you'll receive a callback from our fraud investigation unit." They'll verify your signature samples, request a notarized affidavit, and walk you through restoring the account. I nodded, absorbing every detail as though they were lifelines. A fraud claim number, a temporary hold, a callback within 48 hours. It was more than procedure. It was proof that I was not invisible. Even in this small cubicle under fluorescent lights, someone was acknowledging the theft for what it was. I traced the false signature with my finger. It was familiar in its attempt, like handwriting I had seen at the edge of birthday cards or grocery lists left on the counter. My stomach churned. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone inside my circle, someone who knew enough to try. The banker explained procedures, fraud alerts, investigation timelines. Her voice faded in and out like static. All I could hear was the silence that followed me home, a silence that clung heavier than smoke. That evening, I laid the forged papers on the kitchen table. The light above flickered, casting shadows across the page. I studied each line, each letter, committing them to memory. Whoever had done this had not just signed my name, they had declared war on my dignity. For years I had carried Richard's failures, covered his debts, endured his contempt. But this was different. This was theft with my name on it, a theft that would have erased everything I had preserved for survival. I slid the papers into a worn envelope, folded carefully, tucked away where I knew I would find them when the time came. It was no longer about marriage or betrayal in bed. It was about survival. And I knew then with a clarity that burned that I could not remain silent forever. 2 nights later, Daniel came to the house. He looked uneasy, shifting his weight, his hands jammed into his pockets. His eyes avoided mine as he finally spoke. "Mom," he said slowly, "Megan told me you agreed to help us. She said you signed those papers so we could move things faster. I thought you wanted to support us." The words hit me harder than Richard's smirk ever had. Megan. Her name wrapped around the lie like barbed wire. My own son believing that I would sign away my security, my independence, just to smooth their path. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. Instead, I walked to the drawer where I had hidden the envelope. I placed it on the table between us and slid it toward him. "Look," I said softly. He opened it, his eyes scanning the fraudulent forms, his brow furrowed, lips parting in disbelief. This isn't. He stopped, recognizing something in the strokes of the pen. His silence confirmed what I already knew. Megan's hand was in it. I watched him struggle, torn between loyalty to his wife and the truth staring back at him. My chest ached, but my voice remained calm. "Do you see it now? This isn't about helping. This is theft." Daniel's face flushed, his jaw tightening. "She said it was for us, for the family." "For the family," I interrupted, my tone sharper now. "What kind of family asks a mother to surrender her future without even asking her?" He dropped his gaze, shoulders hunched, shame spreading across his face. The room filled with silence, the kind that forces a person to hear their own heartbeat. In that moment, I knew the audience of my life would be split. Some would say I should forgive because he is my son. Others would say betrayal is betrayal, no matter whose blood runs in your veins. I lifted the porcelain cup, chipped but whole, and sipped the tea gone cold. I didn't answer the question for him or for myself, not yet. But I knew it would not be long before I had to choose. The forged signature on my retirement forms was only the surface of something deeper. I knew it in my bones. I had lived too long with Richard's evasions, Megan's sly remarks, Allison's lingering looks. Betrayal rarely came alone. It bred in silence until it multiplied. I started looking closer, quietly, patiently. I visited the county records office on my lunch break, slipping into the long line of citizens requesting documents. My heart thudded when the clerk handed me copies of property filings tied to my address. The first page nearly stole my breath, an appraisal report for my home, dated only weeks earlier, estimating its value at nearly $500,000. My name was printed across the top as the current owner, but stapled behind it was something worse, a transfer of deed application listing Richard's signature alongside a notarized stamp. Only I had never agreed to any appraisal. I had never walked into a notary's office. My fingers trembled as I turned each page. Someone was preparing to move the house out of my name, my one sanctuary, the roof over my head, and place it into Richard's and Megan's joint ownership. The notary's name was familiar. A friend of Megan's cousin, someone she had mentioned at a family barbecue. The circle tightened. My stomach twisted. I asked the clerk quietly, How much would it cost to file this transfer if it went through? She tapped her keyboard. Standard processing around $300. But you'd also be looking at lawyers' fees, on top of that easily $2,000 to $3,000. $300. That was all it would take for them to erase me from my own home. The thought made me grip the edge of the counter until my knuckles burned. I carried the documents out in a plain manila folder, holding them against my chest as though they were evidence of a crime, which they were. At home, I spread them across the kitchen table under the dim light. Appraisal report, transfer form, notary signature. Each paper another blade cutting into the life I had built with sweat and silence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shatter plates, to tear Richard's suits from the closet. But I didn't. I sat in my chair, the chipped porcelain cup beside me, a faint ribbon of warmth. The cup breathed a thin wisp of heat, upward. I inhaled the faint scent of chamomile and let the fury settle into something colder, sharper. I began to build a file. Copies of every suspicious statement, screenshots of texts Megan had carelessly left on Daniel's phone about when the house becomes ours, receipts Richard had stuffed into his pockets from meetings he never mentioned. Slowly the file grew heavier. Pain weighed me down, but discipline kept me upright. I told no one what I had discovered. Not Daniel, not Lucy, not even Richard, who strutted through the house with a poisonous smile, as though his secrets were safe. Inside, I carried one truth I had lived invisible for decades. Now I would use that invisibility as my weapon. It didn't take long for Megan to test me. One Sunday afternoon, she came over under the pretense of helping with groceries. Her heels clicked across the tile, her perfume cloying in the air. She placed the bags down and looked at me with that rehearsed smile, sweet on the surface, sharp beneath. "Amelia," she began, almost purring. "Have you ever thought about what's best for Daniel's future? He's working so hard trying to keep up. You've done so much already, of course, but maybe it's time to pass things along. Secure the house for him and his family. Isn't that what mothers do?" The words were silk wrapped around barbed wire. She wasn't asking. She was probing. Testing whether I had already discovered what she and Richard were plotting. I folded a dish towel in my hands, pressing the fabric flat, buying myself time. Inside, my heart thudded, but I refused to let it show. She tilted her head, her smile stretching. "It's not that we don't value what you've done, but sometimes older generations hold on too tightly. Maybe you should think about Daniel's future instead of clinging to the past." There it was, the dagger dressed as advice, a suggestion that I was selfish for wanting to keep the home I had fought to maintain, that I was an obstacle rather than a mother. I looked at her carefully, then at the chipped porcelain cup sitting by the sink. My anchor. My reminder that flawed things still endure. I placed the towel down, slowly smoothed my skirt, and gave her the smallest smile. "It's okay, dear," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. Her eyes flickered. She wasn't expecting acquiescence, but she also wasn't prepared for resistance cloaked in silence. She thought she had won a small victory. She didn't see the file growing heavier in my drawer, the folder of papers that would soon speak louder than any argument. As she left, heels tapping against the floor, I let the echo follow me into the stillness of the house. My smile faded, replaced by a steel resolve. I had been underestimated my whole life. Now that miscalculation would be their downfall. The folder on my kitchen table grew heavier with every passing day. It was no longer just a collection of papers. It was a record of how deeply betrayal had woven itself into my home. One evening, while Richard was out working late, I sorted through the pockets of his discarded jacket. I found a crumpled slip tucked deep in the lining, a hotel receipt. The date was only a week old. The room had been paid in cash, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable: Richard Hartfield. The address was across town at a chain hotel he had no reason to visit. I traced the numbers with my finger, each digit a nail hammered deeper into the coffin of our marriage. Beside the receipt was another folded slip, this one from a restaurant bar. 2 glasses of wine, a plate meant for 2. It didn't say her name, but I could smell Allison's perfume lingering on his jacket. The evidence spoke louder than any denial he might offer. But it wasn't just Richard. Megan's fingerprints were everywhere too. One morning, the mailman slipped a thick envelope through the slot. I opened it expecting routine statements. Instead, I found a series of bank letters addressed to Megan with my own account numbers listed in the subject lines. Her name shouldn't have been anywhere near my finances yet. Here it was, letters requesting clarification on joint accounts I had never authorized. I stared at the papers until the lines blurred. My breath came shallow, uneven. The chipped porcelain cup sat beside me on the table. A thin ribbon of warmth rose from my cup, gone cold. I clutched it tightly, afraid that if I let go, I would fall apart completely. Inside, a single thought repeated steady as a drumbeat. They're waiting for me to die. That was the truth, wasn't it? Richard impatient for freedom. Megan eager for ownership. Allison clinging to the promise of wealth not hers. They didn't see me as a person anymore. They saw me as an obstacle, something to be endured until I was gone. The realization burned like acid. My sacrifices, my years of silence, my loyalty. It had all been reduced to a countdown in their eyes. Each forged document, each hotel slip, each bank letter was another reminder that my existence was nothing more than an inconvenience to them. I pressed the cup to my lips, the chipped edge rough against my skin. For decades, I had survived on endurance, telling myself dignity was enough. But now, staring at the evidence, I understood endurance alone would not save me. Action would. And so I placed each new document into the folder, stacking betrayal on betrayal, until the weight of it threatened to collapse the table. The house was quieter than usual the night Daniel came by. He lingered in the hallway, hesitant, listening before he entered the kitchen. I didn't notice him at first. I was upstairs, but the voices carried through the vents. Megan's tone was sharp, impatient. "You need to get her out of the way, Allison. She's holding everything back. If Amelia signs over the house, we can finally secure the loan. Without it, we're stuck." Allison's laugh was brittle, mocking. "She'll never sign. She's too stubborn. We'll just wait her out. She's not young anymore." Daniel froze. His breath hitched audibly as their words reached him. For the first time, he heard the venom without disguise, the plan without pretense. His mother me was nothing more than a hurdle they wanted removed. He stumbled into the kitchen, demanding answers. "What are you talking about? What loan? What house?" His voice cracked with disbelief. Megan recovered quickly, her smile sugary but strained. "Sweetheart, you misunderstood. We were just talking hypothetically about planning for the future. You know how your mother is with money, always so cautious." But Allison's smirk betrayed her. Daniel's eyes darted between them, confusion and anger wrestling across his face. The foundation he had built his loyalty on began to crack. From the top of the stairs, I watched silently. I could have stepped in, revealed the folder of evidence, ended the charade. But I didn't. This was his moment, not mine. He needed to hear it with his own ears, to see with his own eyes the depth of their manipulation. His hands shook as he raked them through his hair. "I can't believe this. Mom's not even cold in her grave, and you're already." He stopped, realizing I was alive and listening. His words broke off into silence, shame tightening his throat. Megan reached for him, but he pulled back. The room swelled with tension, the moral conflict carved into every breath he took. Blood versus loyalty. Wife versus mother. The woman he promised to build a life with against the woman who had given him life. I turned away quietly, my footsteps soft on the stairs. I didn't need to confront him then. I knew the weight of what he'd heard would follow him, gnaw at him, force him to choose. And when the time came, that choice would matter more than anything. When the folder of evidence grew too heavy for me to carry alone, I knew it was time. I couldn't rely on silence forever. Silence had kept me afloat for years, but now it threatened to drown me. That's when I remembered Mr. Gallagher. He had been a colleague of mine decades earlier, back when we were both younger and full of patience for endless paperwork. But unlike me, Gallagher had gone further. He studied law at night, earned his degree, and became a respected attorney. People called him old-fashioned, but to me he had always represented something rare: fairness. I called his office, my voice barely steady. "This is Amelia Hartfield. Do you remember me?" His laugh was warm, steady. "Amelia. Of course I do. What trouble have they dragged you into?" Within days, I was sitting across from him in his modest downtown office, the manila folder between us. His hair was grayer now, his glasses thicker, but his eyes were sharp as ever. He listened as I laid out the documents, the forged signature, the appraisal report, the deed transfer forms, the hotel receipts, the bank letters with Megan's name. He didn't interrupt, only nodded, flipping pages with deliberate care. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, You were right to come. This isn't just betrayal, Amelia. This is fraud. And fraud leaves fingerprints. I swallowed hard, gripping my chipped porcelain cup brought along like a talisman. What do we do? He tapped the folder with one finger. First, we freeze the accounts. Gallagher leaned forward, lowering his voice as if to emphasize the gravity. We'll start with what's called an ex parte application. That means we can go before the judge without notifying Richard or Megan in advance. It's an emergency motion justified, because the risk of losing your funds is immediate. The judge can sign a temporary freeze order on the spot, often within hours. Once that's granted, the bank will receive notice by fax and email, and any attempt to move your money will be blocked instantly. I had spent years thinking of paperwork as drudgery forms, signatures, endless repetition. Now those same forms were shields, the margins filled with the power to stop thieves cold. That will stop any immediate transfer of funds. Then we file for an injunction to block the deed transfer. And finally, we prepare eviction papers. If Richard tries to claim your home as his, we'll make sure the law sends him packing. Hearing the words out loud was like breathing clean air after years of smoke. Each step was practical, tangible, written into statutes and case law. My pain, once invisible, was now outlined in legal remedies. I nodded. So the paperwork becomes my weapon. Gallagher smiled faintly. Paperwork has always been your weapon. You just didn't know it yet. I left his office with copies of motions drafted, the first filing scheduled. The city streets felt different beneath my feet. Lighter, almost steady again. For the first time in years, I carried more than burden. I carried the law itself. It was one thing to have a lawyer. It was another to have a witness. That unexpectedly came from Lucy, my neighbor. Lucy had lived across the street for as long as I could remember. She was in her 70s, frail but sharp-tongued, the kind of woman who noticed everything while pretending she noticed nothing. One evening, as I carried groceries inside, she called out to me, her cane tapping against the pavement. "Amelia," she said, lowering her voice, "I saw Megan the other week, at your door. She had a clipboard, some papers. She signed something before driving off with Richard. It didn't look right to me." My heart thudded. "You're sure?" Lucy nodded firmly. I may be old, but my eyes still work. She wasn't just visiting, she was signing. And Richard was grinning like a fox. I invited her and poured tea into 2 cups, the chipped porcelain one for me, the plain white one for her. As she sipped, she leaned closer. "I know people think I gossip, but this isn't gossip. I'll tell anyone who asks I saw Megan sign." Her words settled like a stone in my chest, heavy but solid. Here it was, the reflective mirror I hadn't expected. Lucy, with no stake in my battles, saw the truth and was willing to speak it. Later, when Gallagher asked if I had any witnesses, I told him about her. His smile widened. "Perfect. A neutral neighbor is stronger than 10 family members. Courts listen when outsiders confirm what blood tries to deny." That night, I stood by the window watching Lucy's light flicker across the street. For years, I had believed myself invisible, unremarkable, fading into the wallpaper of life. But through Lucy's eyes, my reality was visible, undeniable. She had seen the deception for what it was, and in doing so, she reminded me the world notices even when I think it doesn't. As I set my porcelain cup down on the sill, I whispered to myself, "It's not just my fight anymore. They've underestimated how many eyes are watching." The day of confrontation came faster than I expected. Gallagher advised we gather them together. Richard, Megan, and Daniel, so there would be no way to twist words or deny the truth later. He wanted the evidence laid bare in front of everyone under the weight of witnesses. So I called for a family dinner. It was ordinary enough to lower suspicion, but extraordinary in what it would reveal. The table was set. The chandelier glowed softly, and the old porcelain, with its honest flaw, sat at my place, plain but deliberate. Richard arrived first, smug in his tailored jacket, carrying a bottle of wine, as if generosity could mask deceit. Megan came on his heels, her smile sugary, her eyes sharp. Daniel trailed behind them, already uneasy, his shoulders slumped with the tension of divided loyalties. Gallagher was there too, seated quietly at the end of the table, his presence both steady and intimidating. When the meal was served and the first glass poured, Gallagher cleared his throat. Before we enjoyed dinner, he said evenly, "Amelia has something important to share." I rose slowly, the folder in my hands. My heart hammered, but my voice was calm. I spread the documents across the table one after another. The forged retirement transfer, the appraisal report, the deed transfer, forms, the hotel receipts, the bank letters with Megan's name. The pages fanned out like a map of betrayal. Richard's jaw tightened. Megan paled. Daniel's eyes darted from page to page, confusion curdling into horror. I fixed my gaze on Richard. "So you forged my name?" He sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "You've done enough for a lifetime, Amelia. Maybe it's time to let the next generation build on what you started. You're old. You've lived your life. Why cling to things that should belong to the next generation?" The words cut deep, but I didn't flinch. I didn't shout. Instead, I reached for the porcelain cup beside me. I placed it carefully in the center of the table, the chipped rim catching the light. "This cup has survived longer than our marriage," I said softly. "Flawed, yes, but it still holds, just like me." Megan's hands trembled as she tried to defend herself. "We weren't stealing. We were securing a future for Daniel, for the family." Gallagher's voice sliced through her excuses. "Forgery is not securing. It's a felony. Fraud is not family loyalty. It's a crime." He pointed to her signature on the notary documents. "And this, Mrs. Hartfield, is your handwriting." Megan's lips parted, then shut again. The silence was louder than any denial. Daniel's face flushed crimson. "Is this true? Did you really do this?" His voice cracked, caught between fury and disbelief. Richard leaned back, unrepentant. "Of course we did. She would never give it willingly. We had to take it. For you, son. For your future." But Daniel's eyes darkened, the weight of choice pressing down on him. He looked at me, then truly looked at me, as though seeing me for the first time, not just the mother who cooked and saved, but the woman who had carried the family alone. Richard's calm mask finally cracked. His voice rose sharp with anger. "You think you're better than me because you save scraps of money. You think your pennies make you powerful." He slammed his hand against the table, rattling the glasses. I stayed seated, unmoving. The porcelain cup stood steady in the center, a quiet anchor amid the storm. Megan, overwhelmed, burst into tears. "I only wanted security. I only wanted Daniel to have more than we did." She turned to him, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. "Don't you see I did this for us?" Daniel pulled away from her touch, his voice trembling. "No, Megan. You did this for yourself. Mom never took anything from me. You're the ones who tried to take everything from her." The room went still. Neighbors had gathered on the porch, curious after hearing raised voices. A few family members who had been invited for dinner now stood frozen at the edges of the room, their eyes wide, whispers buzzing like flies. The humiliation was no longer private. It was public, undeniable. Gallagher gathered the documents into a neat pile. "These will go before a judge," he said firmly. "But tonight let the truth be clear. Amelia has carried this family while you plotted to strip her of everything. The law will not be kind to thieves." Richard's face twisted with rage, but he had no words left. Megan's sobs filled the silence, the sound hollow and desperate. I looked around the table, my voice steady. "All these years you thought my silence meant weakness, but silence was my strength. And now, silence has ended." Daniel stood then, his shoulders straightening, his voice louder than I had ever heard. "I stand with Mom." The declaration echoed in the room, louder than Richard's shouting, stronger than Megan's tears. The crowd of witnesses, neighbors, relatives, friends, watched every second. A murmur rippled through the room. I caught fragments, whispers sharp as glass. "I can't believe he did this to his own wife." Another voice, lower but firm. "After all those years she carried him." One of Richard's old co-workers shook his head, muttering, "I never thought you'd fall this low." Faces I had known for decades looked back at him with disappointment, not respect. Megan tried to hide her face in her hands, but the sight of neighbors staring, arms crossed, was a punishment more piercing than any judge's gavel. Richard shifted in his chair, color draining from his cheeks, as the whispers grew louder until the shame in the room felt heavier than the air itself. The humiliation was complete, not because I raised my voice, but because truth once spoken aloud needed no defense. And in their eyes, I saw it, Richard's power collapsing, Megan's schemes, unraveling, the truth settling like dust after a storm. Humiliation had found its mark, not in me, but in them. As the gathering dispersed, whispers followed Richard and Megan out the door. Their reputations, once carefully polished, were shattered beyond repair. I stayed behind clearing the table, slowly placing the porcelain cup back in its place. It was chipped imperfect, but it endured. And so would I. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, hearings, and courtrooms. Gallagher moved with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime wielding the law like a scalpel. For me, it was overwhelming rows of benches, the hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of attorneys carrying briefcases. But Gallagher guided me through each step, his steady presence reminding me that justice was not just an idea. It was a process. Our first victory came quickly, a freeze order. Gallagher filed an emergency motion presenting the forged retirement transfer and the attempted deed documents. The judge, a stern woman with steel-gray hair, listened intently as Gallagher laid out the facts. My client's signature was forged. Her assets were targeted through deceit. Immediate protection is necessary. The gavel came down. The accounts were frozen. My home was secured under a temporary injunction. For the first time in months, I breathed without fear that everything would be gone by morning. The full hearing was more grueling. Richard and Megan sat at the defendant's table, their attorney fumbling with objections. Gallagher, calm but relentless, introduced each piece of evidence: the fraudulent forms, the appraisal report, the hotel receipts, the bank letters. He even called Lucy to the stand. She walked slowly with her cane, but her voice was strong. I saw Megan sign papers at Amelia's door. Richard stood beside her. I know what I saw. The courtroom shifted. Megan's face flushed crimson. Richard glared, but his fury had no power here. The judge leaned forward. Forgery, fraud, attempted theft of property. The words carried the weight of a verdict, even before the ruling. Gallagher concluded with quiet authority. Mrs. Hartfield has endured humiliation, betrayal, and calculated deception. But the law is clear, no one is above it. We ask that her property rights be upheld, her accounts restored, and penalties imposed on those who sought to strip her of everything. When the judge delivered her decision, my knees nearly gave out. The property remained mine. The accounts were restored. Richard and Megan were ordered to pay restitution and legal fees. The clerk handed Gallagher and me a file-stamped copy of the judge's ruling. The black ink of the court's seal pressed firmly into the page. Gallagher explained quietly, "This means it's official. The order has been entered on the docket. The judge's minute order, a short summary of the ruling, will be circulated to all parties by mail within the week." I traced the embossed seal with my fingertip, almost in disbelief. Gallagher continued, "Tomorrow this judgment will be sent to the county recorder's office. They'll update the property records, ensuring your deed remains secure in your name. That way, if anyone ever tries to touch it again, the system itself will flag it." Paper-stamped signatures, mundane to most, but to me, they were monuments. Justice wasn't abstract anymore. It was a file-stamped page, a minute order entered into the docket, a deed recorded at the county office. Proof that my name still stood. Their attempt to erase me with forged signatures and false notaries had collapsed under the weight of evidence. As the gavel struck, I felt the porcelain cup in my bag, the chipped rim pressing lightly against the fabric. It was my anchor, my reminder that even fragile things can endure. Walking out of the courthouse, the autumn air felt different, brisk, alive, full of possibility. Justice wasn't abstract anymore. It was ink on paper, seals stamped by clerks' signatures, witnessed by law. It was Gallagher's firm handshake as he told me, "You've won, Amelia. They can't take from you what the law protects." The consequences for them unraveled quickly. Richard, once smug in his arrogance, now faced mounting legal bills and the stigma of a man exposed for fraud. He lost his standing in the community. His business contacts vanished, his reputation destroyed. He had gambled on stealing from me, and he had lost everything. Megan fared no better. Her family, who once admired her ambition, turned cold. At gatherings, she became the subject of whispers, her name linked forever to forged documents and courtroom shame. The woman who prided herself on appearances could not bear the mirror now held before her. And Allison. She slipped quietly out of town. No forwarding address, no goodbye. The mistress who thought she had tethered herself to wealth realized she had tied herself to ruin. Daniel came to me one evening after the dust began to settle. His face was pale, his eyes red with remorse. He stood in the doorway like a boy again, though he was a grown man. "Mom," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I should have defended you sooner. I should have seen what they were doing. I looked at him at the son caught between loyalty and manipulation. My heart ached, but I did not let anger speak. Instead, I set aside the porcelain cup I had been holding and opened my arms. He stepped into my embrace, his shoulders shaking. I thought I was protecting my family, he murmured, but I nearly destroyed the one person who has always protected me. I stroked his back gently. We all make choices, Daniel. What matters is the choice you make now. In that moment, I didn't see betrayal. I saw a son who still had time to learn to grow, to stand taller. Forgiveness didn't erase the past, but it gave us both a chance at a future not defined by bitterness. Neighbors still spoke of the trial, of the humiliation Richard and Megan endured, but I didn't need their pity or their praise. What mattered was that the law had spoken and I had stood my ground. I returned to my routines, to the small rhythms of life. Each morning I poured tea into the chipped porcelain cup, the symbol of endurance that had walked with me through betrayal and back into justice. It was flawed, but it held. And so did I. The house was quiet again. Too quiet, some might say, but to me it was a silence that no longer pressed against my chest. It was a silence I could breathe in. I sat by the window as the late afternoon light slanted across the floor, painting long golden streaks across the wooden boards. In my hands, I cradled the chipped porcelain cup filled with chamomile tea. Steam curled upward, soft and fragrant, carrying with it the calm I had fought so hard to reclaim. I looked out over the neighborhood where children played on bicycles and dogs barked at squirrels, the ordinary rhythms of life moving on. Behind those rhythms, I knew the whispers about my family still lingered. People remembered the firefighters, the courtroom, the humiliation that played out in public. Yet none of that noise reached me here at my window. I took a sip, the rough edge of the chip brushing against my lip. For years I had wondered if endurance was enough, if silence was survival or surrender. Now I understood it differently. Silence had been my shield, but action had become my sword. As I let the tea warm me, I thought of Richard's face, when the judge struck her gavel, the color draining from him like water from a broken pipe. I thought of Megan's tears, smeared makeup, and the gasps of neighbors who realized the perfect couple was nothing but a performance. And I thought of Daniel trembling as he finally stood by me. People believe revenge burns hot like fire, consuming everything in its path. But mine was different. It was slow, steady, unrelenting. Like ice. They think revenge is fire, I whispered inside myself. But mine was ice-cold, precise, impossible to stop once it spread. That truth comforted me more than any cheer from the crowd or headline in the local paper. Fire fades quickly. Ice endures. I swirled the tea in my cup, watching the steam rise. The porcelain was flawed, cracked at the rim, but it still held. Just as I did. As the sun dipped lower, I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of memory settle into something gentler. Betrayal had once felt like a chain dragging me into the ground. Now it was simply a lesson carved into the stone of my life. I thought about the words I wished others would carry with them. Words born from every tear I had shed and every page of evidence I had gathered. Betrayal costs more than loyalty. Dignity outweighs money. True family never betrays. Those words were not just mine. They belonged to anyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or underestimated. They belonged to those who had been told they were too old, too fragile, too weak to matter. They belonged to the countless invisible lives that carried families without applause. I imagined neighbors repeating them when they spoke of me. I imagined Daniel whispering them to his children someday, passing down not the shame of what his father had done, but the strength of what his mother had endured. The house creaked softly as the night air moved in. I lit a single lamp, its glow falling on the chipped cup. The crack along its rim looked deeper in the light, but still it held the warmth of the tea. A flaw, yes, but also a truth perfection was never required to endure. I traced the rim with my finger and smiled faintly. "This is enough," I said to the empty room. Richard was gone. Megan, disgraced, Allison vanished into her own silence. Their shadows no longer loomed over me. I did not need their apologies. I did not need their ruin. Justice had been enough. What remained now was peace, the kind that comes not from forgetting, but from surviving with dignity intact. The kind that hums quietly in the bones after the storm has passed. I leaned my head against the window, listening to the faint sounds of life outside. A child laughed. A car door shut. Somewhere a dog barked twice and then fell silent. Ordinary sounds, but to me, they were music. They meant I was still here. No anger burned in me anymore. No hunger for revenge lingered. Life after betrayal did not transform overnight. It returned in small, almost invisible ways. One morning, I replaced a flickering bulb in the hallway, balancing on a step stool, the light humming steadily again. Another afternoon, I walked to the corner store, the crisp air filling my lungs, a simple reminder that I still owned my steps, my time, my home. Lucy waved from her porch cane in hand and called out, "You look lighter these days, Amelia." I smiled back, the porcelain cup warm in my palm. "Maybe I am," I replied. Peace was not fireworks or applause. It was ordinary mornings, sturdy light bulbs, neighborly greetings. The kind of peace you only notice after surviving a storm. And for me, that was enough. Only a calm resolve, a certainty that I had faced the worst and had not been broken. The chipped porcelain cup cooled in my hand, its tea nearly gone. I set it down carefully on the sill and whispered the words that had become my anchor. True family never betrays, and dignity is the wealth no one can steal. The night deepened, but in my chest, there was only light. I want to leave you with a question. If it were you, if you had discovered the papers, the forged signatures, the whispered plans, would you have stayed silent as long as I did? Or would you have walked away much earlier? That question is not rhetorical. I truly want to hear from you. My story has been one of silence, endurance, and eventually action, but every life is different. Maybe you would have shouted the first day. Maybe you would have packed your bags and never looked back. Or maybe, like me, you would have waited, gathered proof, and let the law speak. Tell me in the comments below, because your words matter. I read each and every one late at night, when the house is quiet, tea cooling in the cup with the tired rim. Your voices remind me that I'm not alone, that dignity resonates beyond the walls of my own life. And while you write, share something more. Tell me where you are listening from. Which city, which state, which corner of the world holds you tonight? I find comfort in knowing this story reaches beyond my window, that somewhere in Dallas or Chicago or Seattle, or maybe even across an ocean, someone is nodding understanding, feeling less alone. If you have ever lived through betrayal, if you have ever carried the burden of being underestimated, I invite you to share your experience. You don't need to give details, only what you feel safe sharing. But when you do, others will read and realize they are not the only ones. That is the quiet strength of community. And if this story touched you, I ask for one small thing: subscribe. Subscribe so you won't miss the next story, the next voice of survival, the next reminder that dignity can be defended. When you subscribe, you join a circle of people who believe that justice matters, that silence can be powerful, and that healing is possible. I do not need applause. I do not need praise. What I need, what we all need, is connection. And that is what I hope these words provide. I'll leave you now with the same reminder I gave myself on the darkest nights when betrayal pressed hardest against my chest, when forged signatures tried to erase my name, when silence seemed like defeat. Paperwork has spoken louder than blood. Paperwork has spoken louder than betrayal. And now, as I sit here with my porcelain cup cooling in my hands, I will say it once more, clearly, firmly, so it stays with you long after this video ends. The paperwork spoke for me. Before we close, I want to turn to you. If you were in my place, would you have stayed silent as I did? Or would you have walked away sooner? I truly want to know. Share your thoughts in the comments, your city, your story, your perspective. I read every word because your voice matters here. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that dignity is worth defending, I invite you to subscribe. That way we can continue this journey together, one story at a time. Stories of resilience, justice, and quiet.